who is also a professor. So she has done a lot of work, especially around fascism, especially fascism in Eastern Europe. She's actually not, her dissertation was on fascism, but she actually went to Eastern Europe and some of our partnerships in Transylvania and Romania to talk about the impacts of fascism, specifically on the Unitarian churches there in Eastern Europe. We're not starting at the beginning. The Berry Street essay is like, this year is about 2 hours long, and that includes like the intro and the respondents and all of that. We're gonna narrow it down, but I do encourage you to go back and look, especially because at the end, like right when we cut off at the end of our time, you will start, launches into a segment about how some of the fascist tactics that she's gonna be talking about were launched, have been launched or have been used within Unitarian Universalism, which is really fascinating. So I definitely suggest taking a look at that when you get a chance. So because we're starting kind of at a midway point, I just want to give a brief intro. Celia Kingman has, so far in her piece, up until the part we're about to stop, she's describing her social position, which has a lot to do with who has been a part of her life. And she was talking about her 3 ancestors that she can actually trace back to the Mayflower. So you'll see that as part of this. So Justin, whenever you're ready, we're ready to go.
It is simply a fact, and it must be named. I have a personal connection. We have a religious connection to the project of violent conquest, genocide, and displacement. My family didn't use those words, but that was the truth behind the simple story. The covering up over generations of these brutalities does not mean that they have no impact. To be white in this country and to have lived here for more than 1 generation is to be a generational participant in massive historical violence and to have been enrolled in maintaining the mythologies that perpetuate that violence even today. White children are forcefully and sometimes forcibly enrolled in the project of whiteness. White children are required to cut off parts of themselves in order to maintain societal and familial approval. Just as people assigned male or female as children are taught to behave in certain ways, so are white children taught to act in ways that distinguish those who are deemed white from those who are deemed not white. Thus, some children are taught the myth of their own separateness and superiority. When, not if, but when, children fail to comply with those gendered or racialized expectations, they experience, at minimum, a removal of approval and connection. This is deeply traumatic to young children, and so we, learn to cut off parts of ourselves to stay connected and to receive the benefits of being within the circle of privilege. To do this, we cut off our compassion, our sense of kinship with other people, and our emotional responses. Cutting off parts of ourselves to survive, which we have all likely done, injures the soul. For those of us who are white, being taught to overlook the atrocities done by our ancestors and the continued oppression and land theft being done by our people, especially when we are told that this oppression and theft is done to secure our own future, this is deeply injurious. This turning away from truth is demanded of children long before a child can be considered complicit. But even when young, most of us do have, deep down, an awareness that something isn't right, that we are being lied to, that we are being enrolled in, and then ultimately choosing to participate in a system of violence. This awareness causes a particular form of moral injury that white people, especially white men, have been passing down generation after generation. And it is absolutely against the rules of whiteness to discuss the psychic wounds of learning to be an oppressor. Friends, this moral injury makes fertile ground for fascism. The belief in one's own special place, combined with the traumatic indoctrination into that belief, the immoral deal one must make to trade parts of oneself for a myth of superiority, this injury creates a psychological and moral framework that makes one vulnerable to fascist ideologies. Now, I want to be clear. White people's moral injury and generational trauma are not comparable to the horrific violence directed at Indigenous and Black people. But white people must dig into our own generational trauma to understand the current situation. White nationalism gets its hooks into white people because of this unacknowledged, unhealed white trauma. Telling the truth and healing that trauma are crucial to the project of resisting fascism. So this afternoon, I want to focus on recognizing and countering fascism without and within our faith. Fascism without seems pretty obvious. We all know that we are in a moment of grave danger. If anyone is left wondering how bad it is, it's very, very bad. It's alarmingly easy, however, for us to grow acclimated and numb unless we pay rigorous attention to the strategies and timelines used by fascists. We're also seeing a rise in fascist thinking within our own faith community. Not necessarily the political ideologies we associate with fascism, but the style of thinking. Please understand that I do not say this lightly. Unitarian Universalism is currently in a moment of major theological transformation and institutional reform. And this transition is causing a backlash within our congregations and among some of our own colleagues. We are moving away from individualism to communitarian values, from white supremacy culture to truly radical liberation, from a concentration of power among historically privileged groups and towards a new form of power sharing. And it is gorgeous. And some are responding to these shifts with anxiety and conflict. Some who are being asked to give up the primacy of their privilege and power are responding with tactics drawn from fascist politics. It's not surprising. The Protestant tradition in North America, the tradition in which we are rooted, has been utterly complicit in the project of fascism and white supremacy. Our faith tradition is rooted in historic hierarchies, the very hierarchies that fascists seek to protect and restore. We have a lot of work to do to dig out the roots of this evil. It is my hope this afternoon, in a very short period of time, to give us some tools to equip us to recognize fascist tactics when they arise around us, and also within our churches and within ourselves as well. I want to offer a hermeneutic which will help us in the work ahead. So let's start by defining the term fascism. The standard definition of fascism is a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of both the nation and the single powerful leader over the individual citizen. I'm going to complexify that a bit by using the work of Jason Stanley, who is the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Stanley is a professor and scholar of philosophy and propaganda at Yale. He describes fascism as an ideology, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a political method. Not all who use fascist tactics are ideologically fascist. We recognize fascists less by their beliefs than by their methods. I'm going to share Stanley's overview of the 10 tactics of political fascism. And in full transparency, what I'm sharing with you now is taken directly from Stanley's work, at times word for word from a video, so don't anybody come and tell me I just committed plagiarism, because I warned you. This is from a video lecture that he gave titled The 10 Tactics of Fascism, which is available on YouTube, and I highly recommend watching it more than once. So here are the 10 tactics of fascism. Stanley opens by explaining that these 10 tactics are bundled, that they cannot be isolated from each other. The first tactic is a mythic past. Fascists always present the idea that there was once a glorious past. In politics, this is represented in the idea that we were once a great nation, notice the past tense, and when we were great, the dominant racial group ruled over others. I think this narrative is going to seem really familiar to you. But now that's been taken away, not lost by the dominant group's actions, but taken away by some group designated as other. Jason Stanley says, fascists are always telling a story about a glorious past that's been lost, and they tap into this nostalgia. So when you fight back against fascism, you've got one hand tied behind your back, because the truth is messy and complex, and the mythical story is always clear and compelling and entertaining. It's hard to undercut that with facts. The second tactic is propaganda. All social movements and all politics use propaganda to persuade. Fascist propaganda, however, makes a distinction between friends and enemies. It casts the other as a threat and presents the idea that these others are fundamentally opposed to the nation. Tactic number 3 is anti-intellectualism. Authoritarianism presents a cult of the leader. In a fascist system, the leader and only the leader sets the rules about what is true or false. So we will see the takeover of the country's media, schools, and cultural institutions to enforce what the leader says is true. Institutions that teach multiple perspectives on history always threaten the leader. Expertise is also always a threat to the leader. Science is a threat to the leader. And if intellectuals are telling the truth, they are a threat. So, anti-racism, critical race theory, definitely a threat. This brings us directly to tactic number 4, the creation of a form of unreality. The scholar Timothy Snyder talks about this a lot, the destruction of notions of reality, that there is an actual reality. Authoritarians determine what we know to be true, undermine what we know to be true, and convince the population that A, everyone is lying, and B, the lies don't matter. In political terms, though, the center of democracy is truth. You cannot function as a democratic citizen if you are being lied to. Jason Stanley says, if you're going to rip the heart out of democracy, you get people used to lies. The fifth tactic of fascism is hierarchy. Hierarchy is absolutely central to fascism. It is the big lie at the center of things. White supremacy, male supremacy, abled supremacy, all of these lies assign people superiority and the privileges and benefits that go with that superiority. And hierarchy goes right into victimhood. Once you have convinced people that they are justifiably higher in the hierarchy, then you can convince them that they are victims of equality. Fascists tell people that equality is victimizing them by making them lose their rightful place or power. Stanley says the goal is to make people feel like victims, to make them feel like they've lost something and that the thing they've lost has been taken from them by a specific enemy, usually some minority outgroup or some opposing nation. According to Ajaris Dixon, writing in Truth Out, fascists believe that democracy has failed them and allowed the majority to be tyrannized by communities that have no right to power, Therefore, fascists seek to eliminate both democratic processes and marginalized communities, to return to an often fictitious and glorified past where their power reigned unchecked. The seventh tactic of fascism is law and order. Under fascism, the definition of law-abiding, though, means loyalty to the dominant group. Members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are considered law-abiding, by very nature. And marginalized groups are seen by their very nature as being not law-abiding. Law and order has nothing to do with justice or equality or protecting people. Law and order structures who is legitimate and who is not. And law and order, my friends, will ultimately be enforced by violence. As fascism scholar Ruth Ben-Ghiat reminds us, the essence of fascism is violence. Now, tactic number 8 is sexual anxiety. In every case, across different cultural and historical settings, the fascist leader will always say, your women and children are under threat. You need a strong man to protect your family. I can't do that without that voice. To protect your families. Fascists make conservatives overwhelmingly terrified of transgendered people and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people and their families, overwhelmingly terrified. According to fascists, these targeted groups are not simply trying to peacefully live their own lives, they're trying to destroy the majority's life, and they are coming for the majority's children. Stanley calls the 9th tactic of fascism Sodom and Gomorrah. Fascist movements typically rest on an urban-rural divide, and fascists use a toxic trope of the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this trope, pure, hardworking, real members of the nation live in rural areas where they work hard with their hands. But when politicians talk about inner city voters or urban voters, we all know what they mean. Black and queer folks, immigrants, Jews, and other people that fascists seek to control or eliminate. And they pit those two against each other. The 10th tactic is what Stanley, a child of Holocaust survivors, calls Arbeit macht frei. Work shall make you free. These words were hung over the gates at Auschwitz. Fascists create an idea that minorities, immigrants, and others are lazy, that these groups need to be taught a work ethic. The mechanism they use is forced labor, whether it's prison labor or work requirements for benefits. The targeted groups must provide free labor as a supposed moral education. According to fascists, then, labor unions are supposedly run by communists who are trying to make things easier for lazy people. College students who protest conservative speakers are described as lazy, spoiled kids who need to get real jobs. The thing is, the end game in this calculation is evil. Valuing people by how hard they work means that the elderly, disabled, and even children can become disposable. The Nazis murdered these groups first because they believed that those who could not work had no value. Is it any wonder that we are now seeing the repeal of child labor laws in this time of rising fascism? Okay, that's Stanley's 10 tactics of fascism. Anybody need a cleansing breath? Now, it's not that each one of these makes a politician or a political movement fascist, but when these elements are present in number, and especially when people are told that they are under an existential threat from the created other, then that's fascism. And it is plain that in the United States, we are in the midst of an orchestrated takeover by fascist political groups. The legislative attacks of the last few months and the civil violence where domestic extremists act to create fear in targeted groups are all on the rise. Remember, fascism is inherently violent, and it begins with these seemingly random actors. But those domestic terrorists are part of the overall plan. Fascist politicians use stochastic terrorism, in which leaders use hate speech to incite seemingly random violence, because a terrified population is more easily controlled, and a terrified population will look for scapegoats. It is vital to understand that we are past the point of voting the fascists out. We have entered an era of violent civil conflict. Voter organizing is no longer a fully sufficient strategy, and we can't keep careening from one election cycle to another. We must work in coalitions to shape a multi-year plan for keeping these fascist politics in check. The ideas of fascism have been activated in a time of great anxiety about global immigration patterns, technological changes, demographic trends, and about climate disasters and wars for resources. And amidst all of this anxiety, people look for simple answers, and fascist politicians supply those answers all too readily, usually by scapegoating. Voting is important, but our immediate moral obligation is to help people out of the path of direct harm, and I will come back to that. I want us to look a little bit more closely for just a moment, though, at this idea of the glorious past and introduce the work of Roger Griffin, who's a professor of modern history at Oxford Brookes University. Griffin defines fascism as a political ideology whose mythic core, now here come the big words, mythic core is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. That's a mouthful. Palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Palingenesis is the concept of rebirth or recreation, from the Greek palin, meaning again, and genesis, meaning birth. The defining characteristic of palingenetic fascism is what Griffin describes as the prevalence of the rebirth myth being projected onto the nation, of an obsession with degeneration and regeneration as socio-historical realities. In this mythology, the nation has become degenerate because it has fallen away from certain hierarchies, particularly racial or gender hierarchies, and the only way to restore the nation to greatness is to undergo a regeneration, a rebirth, a reclamation of those hierarchies. And the goal, my friends, is always the same: the maintenance of power in the hands of a dictator or a group of people, through the use of control and enforced conformity. Now, Some of you may have been wondering when I would get to the My Little Pony part of this lecture. We're here. My Little Pony is a kids show, but the version of this show that aired from 2010 to 2019 is a morally complex and frequently subversive kids show. The story takes place in a fantasy world populated by adorable, brightly colored ponies, unicorns, and Pegasi maybe, who have names like Twilight Sparkle and Rainbow Dash and such. They live in a deeply feminist, matriarchal society in which the highest value is friendship. And this friendship is a pretty radical kind, and it includes the value of celebrating each pony for their unique self-expression. Each pony has something that's special just to them. These are skills like being a good baker, traits like being very, very kind, or it might be someone's incredible sense of style. And these unique qualities are represented visually on each pony by something called a cutie mark, which is a symbol on the pony's upper flank. The pony baker has a cupcake. The stylish pony has 3 diamonds. I don't know if you can see those, etc. The plot lines center around a central group of 7 ponies and their various adventures. And often these adventures are the ordinary problems of friendship. Things like what happens when you feel envious, or what to do when one of your friends is sad. But there are also episodes with more serious topics. One of my favorites is a 2-part episode about, I kid you not, totalitarianism. The band of ponies visits a distant town of ponies where something seems very, very off. Everyone smiles all the time, and the leader is just a little too cheerful. There appears to be no conflict in this town. Most strange is that none of these ponies has a unique cutie mark. Instead, each pony's mark has been replaced by a dull gray equals sign. The intrepid band of friends investigates things and discovers that the leader has tricked the town citizens into giving up their cutie marks, and this then severs them from their unique qualities. The leader has weakened the citizens so that she can control them, which she does by brainwashing the ponies into believing that uniqueness is a dangerous quality that brings conflict and trouble to the community. But of course, the leader of all the ponies has only pretended to give up her cutie mark and her unique qualities. She's covered up her mark with makeup, a fact that our group of intrepid friends discovers. But before the friends can expose her hypocrisy, they are captured, forced to give up their own cutie marks, and imprisoned in a house where they undergo hours of re-education blasting from a loudspeaker. Yes, this is a kid's show. We're going to watch a clip now that begins at that point in the story.
In sameness, there is peace. Exceptionalism is a lie. Free yourself from your cutie mark. Choose a quality as your special talent. Difference is frustration. To excel is to fail. Be your best by never being your best. Conformity will set you free. Conformity will set you free. Conformity will set you free.
Conformity will set you free. Conformity and control are the opposite of freedom. Fascists enforce conformity and control because for fascists to remain in power, they must limit all true expressions of human freedom. Freedom overthrows hierarchies, and without hierarchies, there's no way to retain the power that fascists seek. My friends, there is a specific reason why we are seeing a focused attack on trans rights at this moment. It's because under fascism, difference cannot be allowed to flourish because difference is a form of freedom, and freedom of human expression must be suppressed. Fascists attempt to keep everyone within the narrow roles prescribed to us and will punish or eliminate anyone who deviates. It is crucial to understand this. Attacks on trans folks are an intentional opening salvo and the first target of this round of fascist organizing. In addition to hating any kind of free self-expression, fascists also always try out their tactics on the most vulnerable group. They believe, often rightly, that other people will not act to protect the most vulnerable, especially when they identify a difference that is misunderstood or even generally reviled. Right now, fascists are gauging the public's response. But they will not stop with our trans siblings, and let me be clear, the impact falls most heavily on our trans siblings who are also Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor, and/or disabled. Fascists will see what the public allows and will move to control increasingly broader categories: queer people, immigrants, people of color, Indigenous folks, women, in great broad swaths. They intend to make all of us conform. Remember that law and order means conforming to those hierarchies. It may feel right now like everything is chaotic and that we are struggling on many different fronts, but in actuality, it is all connected. And that sense of chaos, that's also a tactic. Fascists want us overwhelmed and exhausted. Everything fascists do has a point. Each front is another tactic to take and keep power. The attack on the Capitol, threats against governors, defunding of institutions like schools, hospitals, even the potholes in our roads. You know what else? You know what else is a tactic? The lack of COVID response was a tactic. It wasn't ineffectiveness on the part of the Trump administration. It was a deliberate tactic to create chaos and then capitalize upon people's fear and frustration. And oh good, maybe some people would die too. I'm not kidding, it was a tactic. Remember the phrase that went around during the previous administration, the cruelty is the point? That phrase is not quite accurate. Cruelty is not the point, it is a tactic. It is designed to overwhelm us and make us afraid. Perhaps most sickening is this: gun violence is a tactic. Violence, and particularly mass shootings, serve a purpose: to terrorize the population and make us more fearful and thus more eager for an authoritarian leader who can protect us. And this is the real reason that extremist Republicans do not want to do anything about gun violence. These shootings, yes, including school shootings, are a cynical, horrible, evil tactic. It helps me to think of fascism as a hydra. You all remember the hydra in Greek mythology. Hercules was supposed to kill the hydra, this multi-headed snake creature, and the hydra seemed impossible to kill because every time you cut off one head, it was replaced by two more. Ultimately, Hercules killed the beast by getting help from his nephew to cut off the hydra's main head. This is another opportunity, by the way, to remind ourselves that the myth of the lone hero is actually a useless myth. Okay. A hydra is a multifarious evil that cannot be overcome by a single effort. We have to fight on all fronts, not all of us on all fronts, but on all fronts, while remembering that these heads all grow out of one body. Our coalitions must oppose the fascist desire to control anyone and everyone in order to take and retain power. Now remember, those who use fascist political tactics do not themselves have to have a fascist ideology. And this is very important, and it's very different from how the word fascist has been used in popular culture. However, sometimes fascist ideology is itself a political tactic. When it is used by those in power, it enthralls increasing numbers of people into true believers. People who might not have been enthralled become moved to protect what they think is their rightful place in the hierarchy. Fascist thinking is also contagious. Like COVID, it's not a bacterial infection that can be dispensed with simple antibiotics. My experience with long COVID makes a great metaphor here. Fascism is a disease that remains in the body long after the acute stage passes. It's still there. It's still changing your cells, still causing seemingly unrelated illness and disease. Jason Stanley warns that fascism is a permanent temptation of humankind and that we must be continually vigilant against its resurgence. Our historic faith, my friends, is not immune to these fascist trends here and elsewhere. Some of us have raised concerns about the close ties between our siblings of faith in Eastern Europe with the authoritarian government of Viktor Orban of Hungary. And I believe we are right to be concerned about this situation. And I also know that we have our own rising reactionary strain within North American Unitarian Universalism. And in the interest of both time and an appropriate dose of humility, I'm going to stick to this side of the ocean. We must acknowledge the close.
Thank you, Justin. All right, whew, that was a lot. So stamp your feet, take some deep breaths, because that was a lot in a very short amount of time. All right, so we have 2 microphones here, and we're going to do this briefly because we don't have a whole lot of time. But if you have, does this ring true?